Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Okay, so last week I compared the Ryzen 7 3700X and Core i5-10600K in 9 competitive titles using low quality visual settings to see just how much faster the Intel processor was when letting the frame rate shoot sky high, well above what you need for 144Hz gaming. The results are interesting, but for the most part, the margins weren't really that different to what was seen in our original CPU review, which featured demanding AAA titles using high and ultra quality settings. Whereas previously we found the 10600K was 6% faster on average when it came to gaming performance, that margin grew to just 7% using the competitive quality settings in titles such as Rocket League, Fortnite, and PUBG. So it was surprising to see, with the GPU restrictions removed entirely in a number of these titles, that the 3rd gen Ryzen processor wasn't much slower than the Core i5-10600K, and in fact it even pulled ahead in a few instances. This had me wondering just how well the 2700X under the same test conditions would stack up against the 3700X and of course the 10600K. Given that in our day one content we saw that the 3rd gen Ryzen part was up to 22% faster in games, it stood to reason that we'd see a lot more margins of that size or similar in these CPU limited gaming tests. So I went back and added the 2700X to the results, and I also took the time to once again overhaul our CSGO testing using a method that was recommended by a number of very keen CSGO gamers. Also for testing, we're once again looking at out-of-the-box performance with XMP loaded using CL14 DDR4 3200 memory for both the AMD and Intel processors. The 10600K also won't be power limited, as that's typically not the out-of-the-box experience. Also, in our original review, we found that a 5.1 GHz overclock could boost gaming performance by as much as 12%, so keep that in mind. And we've also found gains of over 20% for Ryzen processors when tuning the memory timings. And that isn't to say Ryzen performs better when tuned up, that's certainly not the case, but in our experience we've found AMD and Intel processors enjoy similar performance gains when they're fully tuned up. Finally, we've again got 9 games to look at, all of which have been tested at 1080p and 1440p using low quality settings with both an RTX 2080 Ti as well as an RTX 2060 Super. First up, we have the Battlefield 5 results at 1080p using low quality preset, and here we're already faced with some pretty interesting results. The 2700X isn't much faster with the 2080 Ti when using the low quality settings opposed to the ultra settings. We're looking at about a 13% improvement in average frame rate with no change to the 1% lows. Also for reference, with the ultra quality settings, the 3700X is 9% faster than the 2700X, but here we're seeing a 21% increase in performance for the 3rd gen Ryzen processor. This really highlights just how much of a step forward AMD made with their Zen 2 architecture. And perhaps more surprising is the fact that even with the RTX 2060 Super, the 2700X is still the performance limiting component, as here the 3700X was 18% faster. Of course, the 2700X was still good for over 100 FPS at all times, so I imagine most of you will be satisfied with that level of performance using the higher quality settings. But it is clear for competitive gaming, the 2700X is the primary bottleneck. The 1440p results are a little more favourable as we start to see test conditions become a bit more GPU bound. The 3700X was 9% faster than the 2700X when looking at the average frame rate with the RTX 2080 Ti, but 16% faster when comparing the 1% low data. Even with the 2060 Super, we see up to a 12% performance increase when going from the 2700X to the 3700X. Moving on to Fortnite, and here we're looking at virtually identical performance using either the 2060 Super or 2080 Ti, as all 3 CPUs are the primary performance limiting component. So that being the case, let's just focus on the 2080 Ti data. Here we're again looking at up to a 23% performance improvement for the 3700X over the 2700X, taking the average frame rate from 265 FPS up to 325 FPS. The 10600K is still 8% faster than the 3700X, which is an impressive result for Intel, but at the same time it is quite incredible how much AMD managed to bridge the gap in a single generation. I should note though that the 2700X was able to maintain over 200 FPS at all times in our demanding Fortnite benchmark, so while much slower than the Intel processor, I imagine for most gamers it's still going to get the job done just fine. But clearly, if you're serious about Fortnite and you want the maximum performance possible, it just wouldn't have made sense to purchase a 2nd gen Ryzen processor in favour of the Intel alternatives. Jumping up to 1440p, and here we see with the RTX 2080 Ti, we're still looking at a substantial performance uplift for the 3700X over the 2700X. Here the 3rd gen Ryzen processor was up to 21% faster. It's also worth noting that the 10600K is up to 33% faster. Basically, if AMD were competing with Intel's 10th gen range using the 2nd gen Ryzen parts, it'd be a bloodbath for the red team. Of course, AMD did drive down Intel pricing with 3rd gen Ryzen, but still, the margin between the 2700X and 10600K is truly massive. That said, when using a less powerful GPU, like the RTX 2060 Super, we've already run into a fairly strong GPU bottleneck at 1440p, and now the 10600K is just 8% faster than the 2700X. Now, for testing CSGO, I previously moved away from the community benchmark to bot matches, which more accurately represented real gameplay. But getting accurate data with bots can be a bit tricky. The good news is, it turns out there's an even better method for accurately measuring real gameplay, and that method sees us take advantage of the replay function by viewing pro matches. So I've gone back and tested all 3 CPUs using this new method. Previously, we found the 3700X to be 8% faster than the 10600K when comparing the average frame rate, and up to 22% faster when comparing the 1% low data. The frame rates, however, were much higher, as the bot match didn't see smoke grenades regularly going off. Using the pro match, we see the 3700X and 10600K are now much more evenly matched, with basically no difference between the two. Yet despite that, the 3700X was up to 31% faster than the 2700X. And taking the 1% low figure, we see it go from 163 FPS right up to 214 FPS. So again, a truly massive generational leap there. Here we see the margins do remain much the same at 1440p. Here the 3700X was up to 34% faster than the 2700X, which saw it deliver comparable performance to the 10th gen Intel Core i5 processor. Next up, we have the Rainbow Six Siege results, and here we find our biggest margins yet. Whereas the 2700X limited the RTX 2080 Ti to 304 FPS on average, the 3700X was almost 40% faster, hitting 420 FPS. That performance uplift seems almost too significant, but remember, core-to-core communication was improved by up to 50%, as seen in our day one review. And those margins are less extreme when using the RTX 2060 Super, but even so, here the 3700X was still up to 22% faster. The RTX 2060 Super results at 1440p see all 3 CPUs deliver virtually the same performance, so here we're heavily GPU limited. Big margins are seen though when using the RTX 2080 Ti, and although the 2700X matched the average frame rate of the 10600K, the Intel processor was still 13% faster when comparing the 1% low data. The PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds results show a more mild 13% performance uplift for the 3700X over the 2700X, and while that's still an impressive generation-on-generation uplift, it is one of the smaller gains we've seen so far. It's also worth noting that the Core i5-10600K was still 17% faster than the 3700X, so Intel does enjoy a substantial performance advantage in this title. The 10600K was also up to 32% faster than the 2nd gen Ryzen processor. Because the 3700X is able to bridge the gap between the 2700X and 10600K, we find when using a less powerful GPU like the RTX 2060 Super that the 3rd gen Ryzen processor is able to push the mid-range GeForce GPU to its limits. In fact, the 3700X was up to 21% faster than the 2700X with the slower GPU. Increasing the resolution of 1440p reduces the 3700X's lead over the 2700X to just 10% with the RTX 2080 Ti, and despite that, the 10600K was still up to 19% faster. So again, for maximum game performance in a title such as PUBG, the Intel processor is clearly the superior option. Though I will once again note that for most of you, you probably don't require north of 150 FPS in this title. Moving on to the Call of Duty Modern Warfare results, and here we're only looking at very mild performance gains when moving from the 2700X to the 3700X, just an 8% increase in average frame rate, while the 10600K was just 5% faster than 3700X. Then with the RTX 2060 Super, we see basically the same performance from all 3 processors. And then the 1440p data sees virtually the same margins. We're looking at up to a 6% improvement for the 3700X over the 2700X with the RTX 2080 Ti and RTX 2060 Super. Interestingly, when testing with Rocket League, both Ryzen processors provided similar 1% low performance, despite the 3700X boosting the average frame rate by 17%. I should note though, by default, Rocket League does have a 250 FPS frame cap, though it can be removed by editing a configuration file. So that being the case, even the 2700X will max out the RTX 2080 Ti prior to any modifications to the game files. And the margins close up a little bit at 1440p as the game starts to become more GPU bound, but again, the 2700X and 3700X deliver comparable 1% low performance with the averages well over 400 FPS. World of Tanks is a pretty slow-paced tank shooter. The game's more about positioning than it is flick shots. So 144Hz displays that are fed 144 FPS will be more than sufficient for this one. And that being the case, the 2700X is perfectly fine for World of Tanks gaming, as allowed for over 170 FPS at all times. Still, looking at this purely from a performance standpoint, the 3700X was up to 22% faster, which is a significant performance uplift for a single generation. Also, without 3rd gen Ryzen, Intel would be up to 37% faster than AMD in this title. The margins seen at 1440p are really much the same. Here we're still primarily CPU limited, but again, even the 2700X allowed for over 170 FPS at all times. Last up, we've got the War Thunder results, and here we've got another example of just how much of a significant step forward AMD made with Zen 2. Here the 3700X is up to 48% faster than the 2700X when looking at the 1% low data, and 42% faster for the average frame rate. So the 2700X heavily limits system performance in War Thunder, and although a minimum of about 250 FPS is still quite impressive, it's a far cry from what the Intel processor can achieve, and the 3700X goes a long way in reducing the deficit to the blue team. Even at 1440p, the 3700X is still up to 43% faster than the 2700X, while the 10600K is just 14% faster than the 3700X, which admittedly is still a pretty decent margin. But it does seem a lot less significant given we're talking about 348 FPS versus 397 FPS. Now here's a look at the average performance seen across the 9 games just tested. Comparing the 1% low data, we see that the 3700X was on average 20% faster than the 2700X, and 26% faster when comparing the average frame rate. Those are some truly impressive generational performance gains. But having said all that, the 2700X still enabled highly playable performance with smooth frame rates. So for many gamers, that difference just won't be realized, particularly given you're almost always GPU limited under realistic test conditions, extreme competitive gaming being about the only exception. The 3700X was still around 22% faster when using the slower RTX 2060 Super, though that's not surprising given the quality settings used at 1080p. This also highlights the fact that anything faster than an RTX 2060 Super is pretty pointless for competitive gaming. For some of you, these results might be quite surprising, especially given the fact that this sort of game testing isn't something that we've done much of in the past, and I also don't believe many other tech media outlets have provided this sort of data either, which makes sense given that, for the most part, you probably aren't seeking extreme frame rates in titles such as Rocket League, War Thunder, and Fortnite, for example. That said, we have included low-resolution testing in the past, and that did reveal the 8700K to be up to 52% faster than the 2700X, albeit in an older version of CSGO using an inferior test method, and that particular result was an outlier. Still, while the 10600K was on average 35% faster than the 2700X in this test at 1080p using low quality settings, we have found similar margins in the past when testing titles such as Far Cry Primal, Total War Saga Thrones of Britannia, StarCraft 2, Wreckfest, and World of Tanks as some examples. We've also found very significant performance in cache bandwidth, core-to-core communication, and DRAM latency in past IPC tests when comparing the 2700X and 3700X. Something else I found quite interesting was a 2-year-old video I made comparing the Ryzen 7 2700X and Core i7 8700K with a 35-game benchmark. When forming my conclusion for that video, I broke down the cons and pros of each option, and in the end I said I'd personally get the Core i7 8700K, it's just a better gaming CPU. I noted that although the 2700X packs 2 extra cores, which does make it a superior performer in core-heavy workloads, I didn't expect that to give it an advantage in games within the next few years. Fast forward a few years to today, and the 8700K, which has essentially been rebranded as the 10600K, is still faster than the 2700X in all games. Though the margins in more demanding AAA titles under realistic test conditions are more like 12% rather than the 35% seen here in these competitive gaming benchmarks. Still, for roughly the same price, I'd buy the 8700K over the 2700X for gaming. Unfortunately though for Intel, things have changed on the AMD front, and quite significantly. As we just saw, Zen 2 was a massive leap forward for AMD, and in my opinion, gaming performance is so close now relative to Intel that it really doesn't matter for the vast majority of gamers. And that does seem to be the general consensus throughout the tech community. It'll be interesting to see what kind of step AMD can make with Zen 3. Hopefully that's later this year. And I suspect it won't be too long before Intel's feeling some serious pressure on all fronts. But of course, hopefully Intel can provide some decent IPC gains with future generations, but I have to say the immediate roadmap isn't looking all that promising. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. If If you liked the video, you know what to do. You can subscribe for more content like this if you haven't already. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Hardware Unboxed and get a bit more involved with the channel, then check out our Patreon account. The link for that is in the video description. You get access to our exclusive Discord chat, monthly live streams, Q&As, behind the scenes videos, all that information. Again, click the link in the video description to find out if you are interested. But above all else, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.